To help make a start on this project, I'm going to break it down into 3 sections. Section 1 is the backer. Section 2 is the 2 verticals that go either side of the backer. And then section 3 is the fluted pieces that go in between the 2 verticals. To make a start on the project, I'm going to begin with the actual backer itself. So for the backer itself, I'm going to be using 3/4 of an inch thick white oak veneer plywood. And it's just like regular plywood, except the top and bottom has a real thin layer of white oak. So once all the edges are covered up, it just looks like a big piece of white oak. So the main reasons why I went with plywood instead of solid white oak for the backer is because 1, I mean, it looks like a big piece of white oak anyways. 2, it's about half the price. And 3, it's probably more than half the weight. So bearing in mind this thing's going to be hanging from the wall, so it's a good thing for me to make this as light as I possibly can. So next I cut it to the width and just oversized on the length on my track saw. Then put it aside so that I can make a start on the 2 side pieces. So for the material on the 2 vertical pieces, I'm going to be using this solid 8/4, 2-inch thick white oak. And as you can see, it's pretty rough and it's not very flat. So we're going to take it over to the boneyard and get it nailed up. So first things first, I picked 2 pieces that best suited this part of the project. And then broke them down roughly oversized on my miter saw. And then brought them over to the boneyard and then put them through the jointer to get them nice and flat and one nice square edge on one side. And then put them both through the planer to bring them down to just over 2 inches in thickness. And then once they're milled up, I then cut them to the final width at 4 inches on my table saw. So now that my pieces are milled up to the width and thickness that I want, I now have to cut a rabbet out the back of each one to allow for the backer. So I'm going to cut it at 3 inches wide by 3/4 inch deep, and that's going to give me a nice wide surface to glue the backer to these vertical pieces. And the best way for me to do that is to set up my dado stack on my table saw. Set it at 3/4 inch high and as wide as I possibly can. And then remove the material a little bit at a time until I've cut out that whole area that I wanted to cut out. So now that the side pieces are milled up, I can bring back the plywood backer, and I'm just going to glue one of the side pieces to the backer for now, and then I'm going to glue the other one when I come to glue all the fluted pieces, just to make that whole process a lot easier. So for now, I'm going to glue and clamp one of the pieces to the plywood backer and let it dry for a couple of hours. And now in the meantime, while all this is drying, I can make a start on those fluted pieces. So each one of the fluted pieces is its own individual component, and each one is 1.5 inches wide by 1 inch in thickness. So I'm going to be making it out of the remainder of the 2-inch white oak stock that we have. So I'm going to have to take it over to the boneyard and then get it nice and flat on the jointer, and then bring it down to 1.5 inches in thickness on my planer. And then cut them down on my table saw to 1 inch wide length. So now I got a bunch of these pieces milled up, I now have to cut out the fluted section. And there's many ways to do that, but probably the safest way is on my router table. So this is my router table, and the router bit itself that I'm using is a 1.5 inch wide with a 3/4 inch radius rounded nose bit. So once my router bit is inserted, I then clamped my fence down to 3/4 of an inch away from the center of the router bit, which is half the thickness of the material that we're cutting. I then set my router bit to 1/4 of an inch in height and then continue to raise it in between each pass until all the material is removed and I have about a 1/16 of an inch wide flat section on the top of each piece. So now that all these pieces are milled up and I'm happy how they look, I dry assembled the door together to make sure everything fits together nice and tight and it looks like how I want it to look. So now all I gotta do is take it apart, glue everything. and then clamp it together and let it dry overnight. So now that this has had enough time to fully dry, it's now time to take it back out of the clamps, trim the ends and cut it to length with my track saw. And then give the whole door a very good sand. So while I was sanding this, it got me thinking, and I've come to realize that I got a bit of a flaw in my design. So this door will be replacing an existing door that's obviously already there. And I'm gonna be using the existing hardware. And that hardware comes with a little bracket that basically guides the door and stops it from swinging around. Now, I got all these fluted sections in here, and I'm concerned that these aren't really gonna work with that guide. It's just gonna keep on catching all the time, and that's not gonna work. And when I originally designed the door, I did design it to have a bottom and top rail, but I didn't like the look of it, and I preferred it when the fluted sections ran the whole length of the door. So to overcome that issue, I'm gonna attach a real thin strip of white oak to the underside, the same thickness as the door, and the same length as the door, and that's gonna help guide it well through the guide. And that piece is going to stop it from catching on all these little ridges. Hopefully, in theory, it should work a lot smoother. So now that that's complete, I can make a start on the handles. And on the front, the main face of the door, instead of attaching the handle, as it's solid white oak on both of the rails, I'm going to route it in a groove, which is going to act as the handle. In order to cut out a perfect groove 1 inch wide by 12 inches long, I made a super simple jig out of some scrap plywood. I basically made 2 marks 12 inches away from each other, and then using a 1 inch wide router bit in my router table, I plunged the groove from one line to the other, which gives me a perfectly straight cutout for my router to follow. So now all I've got to do is clamp the jig into the position that I want, and then using a mortising bit in my router, I can then plunge away the material to the depth that I want. So now that that's routed in, and I like the look of it, and it's going to act well as an integrated door handle. Unfortunately, I can't do the same on the underside because it's a plywood core, and that would just look garbage. I also can't use a traditional handle or a knob where the screws are coming from the back, because you'll see the head of the screws on the face of the door, which will also look garbage. So instead, I found this little handle which I got from my local Lee Valley, and it's oak to match the door, and it has screws that go through the handle rather than through the face of the door. And I'm going to throw that on once the door is installed. So now all I'm going to do is give the whole thing a good finish sand. And then 2 coats of Osmo oil raw. And then meanwhile, I can head upstairs, take off the existing door, remove the hardware, and reinstall it on this new door. And then now all that's left is to get this beast installed.